Hello, class. This is the recording for the second unit for our American Literature course for this semester on identity and permissions. Today is the 7th of September, but you have until tomorrow, the 8th, to finish up your discussion posts for the first unit, which was on Sister Outsider, Lord's collection of essays, and then we will move into talking about this week's book, Citizen, an American Lyric by Claudia Rankine. Out of all of the books that we will be looking at this semester, this one is the one you are most likely to have probably run into in a before college context or perhaps in another college class, but we'll see, okay? Very interesting book. It's going to be our sort of second foray into what we will term as nonfiction, right? Lord was writing what we originally described as nonfiction, right? Which is just, it's not fiction, it's not poetry, it's the third genre, right? Lots of essays, right? Here, we are brushing up on what is sometimes colloquially called the fourth genre, but it's this idea of the lyric essay, which we, generally speaking, most publishers will still qualify it under nonfiction, but it's prose, so not just straight verses like poetry would be, but it has that lyrical quality to it. It doesn't follow exact syntactical and grammatical rules that outright English prose in the expository would follow, right? Things can get a little bit more experimental. So you'll notice that going through this book, that there's plenty in here. It doesn't necessarily look like any given essay. There's a lot of fragments or specific scenes. Punctuation can kind of go here or there, right, depending on things. And distinct attention is paid very often to pronouns and the location of both the speaker and the reader within the book, right, in accordance with other characters that might appear within. You'll notice that there are, in a lot of the sections of this book, which we'll talk about in a second, that are much more memoir-based, right? So speaking ostensibly from the, in general sense, speaker's perspective, but in a lot of senses, we can probably discuss them as being Claudia Rankine's particular experiences, right? We can kind of come to grips with the fact that a lot of characters in those sections will not be named so much, and it's not out of an unimportance of their characters in those particular moments, but more specifically in the reality that it's more about the scenario. She wants us to look at the particular scene that's happening and think about it accordingly. Okay, compare that to other sections we'll get to in the book that have much more focus on named persons making particular arguments or named persons tracking them through experience, as well as just kind of the reality of who they are in a particular moment is important, right? We're examining aspects of American culture through particular moments in time, right? And where hers, it's much less important to us to understand exactly who is doing what names to all the side characters, for us to understand these bigger pictures and to kind of put ourselves in that scenario where it's much more outside us, and not as tightly inside the head of, for example, the speaker. We have these, these moments about Serena Williams or Zidane Zidane or anything of the sort where we can kind of distinctly track through the kind of cultural references to this person, and knowing who we're talking about culturally makes a difference because we all have our own conceptions of who this person is and what happened and how people reacted to it. So those are a little bit more specific, and she pays particular attention and kindness to the realities of a number of incidents of just horrible violence and the like that we will get to in a later section. I guess it's a general kind of blanket term for the book, compared to Lord's essays. Technically speaking, on like a craft level, like how the words are put together, this book is a more complicated read, right? There's a lot more nuance and craft. We're delving into the poetic in a way that Lord would agree was valuable, but at the same time, it's going to require you to do a bit more thinking about the exact way the words are put together. Further than that, still on the kind of like tiers of difficulty of material to engage with, this material should, for the average thinking, feeling person, be very understandable and easy to engage with on an emotional level, which is part of its difficulty, right? We're talking about hurtful things and hurtful experiences and realities that are ugly in the most kind way of describing it. At the best, there could be described as ugly. So just kind of understand that. I will say that kind of doubly so in everything that's been going on kind of in the popular media sphere of the U.S. lately, let alone our just kind of general 2020 and then everything, in all honesty, since 2016. But Rankine here would even describe that, these things have been going on for as long as there's been in America, right? But they're difficult things to talk about, right? And this book does a very good job of unpacking them. My suggestion to you would be that despite the fact that it's relatively short, I believe it's only like 150 some odd pages, and most of the pages are barely like a quarter of the page in very large print. If you were just reading for time, you could churn through this book, right? Take your time with it. Give yourself some time to think on each of the sections. I believe there's 7 of them numbered throughout. And I'm about to go through kind of like what the big takeaways are from each of them. But give yourself the time to sit with this book. I can tell you from times that I've had it instructed to me, this book is a lot to have kind of on your mental plate. And it takes a lot of unpacking. So be kind enough to yourself with as much stress as everyone's got going on to just take your time with it. Don't leave it to the last minute and don't try to rush it. Okay. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started with the book, right? So like I said, 7 sections, okay? You'll notice that I have this lovely print version. There are illustrations in color throughout, right? I find them to be interesting and very useful kind of companion pieces. There's a lot of instances, especially later in the book, where these things seem like they're at least stated to be scripts that would have originally been paired with video, right? So it's interesting to think about, what if someone was telling you this, reciting this text to you over video of the incidents in question, right? So if we look at the publication date, for example, this is pretty recent. It's from 2014, right? So 2 years before the Trump presidency, kind of the height of the Obama presidency, and as we'll unpack in this, still in a place of just profound systemic racial divide and pain that comes with that. Okay, so we have, like I said, the book is broken into sections. You can see they're numbered usually by a Roman numeral on blank page. Don't be tricked necessarily by some of the times that we are given white space, like a place for just a blank page or two, right? And if you want to talk about that in your responses, and do you guys think that's neat, or do you think they come at interesting times? It's up to you, but just double check them to see if they've got a Roman numeral when they show up. Okay. The first section, right? I kind of would term as, despite the fact that there is an ongoing thread of the memoir in here, this is the most where we get to understand, to me, the where the speaker's coming from in this, right? So it's the childhood memoir to me, right? Or the memoir of youth, right? There are, generally speaking, page per page, we are given a series of instances, and a lot of the book is broken up in this particular format, where it's like, here's this page, and here's a particular example of an exposure to an event that is formative and also indicative, right? Like there's two different things here, right? Like it leaves an impact on the speaker, but it is also indicative of a larger conversation that's taking place not only throughout the book, but like just across the American mental space, right? The reality of, especially in these instances, like systemic racism, right? So let's flip through a couple of them. Like even if you get to page 6, right? Jim Crow Road, right? As a kind of reference to where these old but still omnipresent signs of the kind of like horrific history with race relations that the United States has still pop up in places, right? Even if, for example, Jim Crow Road was literally named after some local dude who had been Jim Crow and done a good thing, right? For the average person driving by, that wouldn't be a reference point, and for the average person of color, it might mean something different, right? But, which is why you get a lot of arguments about kind of specific figures. I come from Miami, as I've mentioned before, and there's a large discussion going on, for example, about a very prominent neighborhood in the Miami-Dade / Broward area that's called Plantation, right? Where there's been a long-standing kind of rumble of push for, is this really an appropriate thing to still name stuff knowing the history of plantations in the United States? But at the same time, right, you have people who are just like, it's just the name of a place. What difference does it make? I think this book and Lord's discussions previously do a good job of explaining what the problem with that is, but it's just kind of worth noting where kind of two sides of these discussions would come from, right? There are exposures to particular moments in this section that I think are very indicative of what it's like for a young person of color and a young woman of color kind of going through youth and exposure to all of these kind of microaggressions up through like full-on aggressions, right? So let's look at one, for example. We can look at the one on what for the print version is page 12, right? Obviously, if you're using a different version, it can be a little difficult to track these because they're not necessarily titled, right? So that's why we're going to talk about them section by section. But here, so we have, because of your elite status from a year's worth of travel, you have already settled into your window seat on United Airlines when the girl and her mother arrive at your row. The girl looking over you tells her mother, "These are our seats, but this is not what I expected." The mother's response, "I see." The mother's response is barely audible. "I see," she says. "I'll sit in the middle." Right? So this kind of idea that even just in the witnessing of her, there's something in the way that the mother responds that seems off, right? Which seems to be the implication of this section, right? You'll run into a lot of these where Rankine wants you to do the thinking, right? Put yourself in the headspace of this person when the mother barely says anything in response to seeing you there and the daughter just pointing out, "Oh, this is where we sit," right? The change in the mother's tone doesn't mean something, doesn't it? I think what Rankine would be saying is that it means something to the speaker at the very least, which means something in a broader sense. But it's an interesting point to come across. Rankine's going to use this technique a lot through the book, where she'll give you a situation and encourage you to think about it, right? What does it mean, right? And I think a lot of that comes from a reasonable struggle, which can come up a lot in memoir in general, which is to examine what has come in our lives or in the writer's life or the speaker's life and try to understand the meaning behind it. What does this mean? Like, this sticks with me, but what does it mean, right? So I think Rankine invites us in to do a lot of this work with her in an interesting way, right? We have another one here that I think is very indicative to another big theme throughout, right? On page 16, when a stranger asks, "Why do you care?" you just stand there staring at him. He has just referred to the boisterous teenagers in Starbucks as the N-word, right? "Here I am standing right here," he responded, not necessarily expecting him to turn to you. He is holding the littered paper cup in one hand and a small paper bag in the other. "They're just being kids. Come on, no need to go all KKK on them," you say. "Now there you go," he responds. The people around you have turned away from their screens. The teenagers are on pause. There I go, you ask, feeling irritation begin to rain down. Yes, and something about hearing yourself repeating this stranger's accusation in a voice usually reserved for your partner makes you smile. Right? Very interesting, right? It's this idea of obviously something here is happening that is a problem and she's drawing attention to it. I think the thing that's the most interesting in that particular anecdote, which comes up a lot, is this pushback that comes from speaking up against it when it's not directly about you, right? And I think this is a neat intersection with things Lorde has talked about, where we are all a bundle of intersected parts of ourselves, right? So womanhood to person in Starbucks to black person, right? So on and so forth. Here there is an intersected level of, just outrage here, where it's I'm standing right here, right? And you said that, right? And to push forward and lay out what this person had done as outrageous, and he pushes back, suggesting that her pushing on him is the outrage, right? And you'll see throughout the book there's this common thing of what pushes against us in such a way that there's this idea that speaking up is somehow in and of itself, speaking up against these kind of injustices is in and of itself framed as problematic in some way, right? You'll see a lot of that nowadays, especially with protesting, right? You'll see a lot of people push for, you shouldn't be protesting, you should vote, right? You shouldn't riot, you should do this the right way, right? And then on the flip side, you'll have a very reasoned argument of, well, if you're telling me that I should protest politely, right? Look at how you responded to the idea of taking a knee, right? Which is a very polite, quiet, but powerful way of protesting, right, on a large stage, right? That was even pushed as, this is too far, this is not the place for it, right? Well, where is the place for it if not in response to it, right? I think Rankine kind of keeps shining a light on that. Like, why does society push us to be quiet about these injustices, okay? There's a couple other neat ones in there that I'll let you guys take the time to read. Now, if we flip to 2, right? Number 2 is probably out of the book the one that sticks with you the most in memory, right? Just because it's so comprehensive. Here we get kind of a two-pronged takedown of some realities, right? A breakdown of 2 points, right? Hennessy Youngman's kind of argument for how to be successful based on experience and exposure and his perspective on how to be successful as a black artist, paired with someone who in her own kind of physical art and just in general is inherently a success while being black, which is Serena Williams, right? The kind of desperate picking apart of Serena Williams as such a dominant force in tennis and what her presence there means to a sport that, traditionally speaking, is very wealthy, white, and straight, right, is fascinating, right? I think the first part of the book, I think on some levels we can inherently understand, or we have experienced or seen people that we know brush up against those kind of smaller personal moments that still have these profound meanings, right? The Serena Williams one, for me, like, it's one of those, I don't necessarily pay attention to tennis, so I was aware of Serena Williams in passing. And it's just, she is a public figure. She's very well known. Serena and Venus Williams were, especially to me as a layman about tennis, the face of tennis, right? So I think this essay works on 2 fronts, in the sense that if you are familiar with tennis and the way that things are kind of put forward in that community and what Serena Williams has had to deal with in terms of racism against her and just kind of aggression against her as literally just a black woman's body in a space that is so white, right? It does a very good job, if you are familiar with tennis in that scenario, of pointing out, are you not noticing these many compounded issues that all add up to irrefutable evidence of a problem here. And then as a layman, it also does a good job of being like, you might not have been watching this and just know Serena Williams, like in my example, as this like kind of bastion of, it's Serena Williams, the best tennis player, right? And showing like, no, her success is even more than that, and what she has to put up with is more heinous than you could have possibly known without keeping up with it, right? I will suggest that you take the time to read through this accordingly. There is an interesting kind of temporal anecdote that we can put up against that. Look in the news about the current U.S. Open story with the number one for the men's U.S. Open being disqualified for a term that comes up in here as being very important, a flagrant kind of expression of anger, right? Compare what he was disqualified for and the flagrancy of that and the consequence of that to what Serena Williams deals with, right? It's interesting. I just want you guys to think about it. I think it's a neat bit of serendipity that there's another kind of high profile story of a disqualification of a tennis star. And in this instance, it's a white man, right? So compare them against each other and think about it, okay? Number three, right? Number three, I would generally describe as another dive back into the memoir, right? Where it's personal experience comparisons, but what I would instead describe this section as, and I'm curious to see if any of you would agree or disagree in your discussions, this is a series of what I described as incidents, right? Which is a very gentle way of describing essentially repeated aggressions and microaggressions, right? But it's specifically versions of those where they're noticed, acknowledged, and all of a sudden everyone is uncomfortable. And I think what Rankine kind of pushes against, right, and highlights here is how much of that discomfort is like wrongfully, I would say, drawn from the pointing out of the problem, and that people seem discomforted or uncomfortable in the presence of someone who's acknowledged that you've wronged them, right? Or you've done something that is untoward towards them, right? What I find interesting here, right, is obviously Rankine is talking primarily in this section about blackness in America, and if we look back at what Lords talked about in her books, right, we have this understanding that there isn't necessarily an equivalency of suffering for being in different marginalized spaces, right? But there are similarities, right? We can understand some of the feelings even if we don't necessarily experience them in the same intensity or the same way, right? So for example, it would be wrong to say that the LGBT experience is directly analogous to the black experience in the United States in terms of oppression and so forth, right? But at the same time, in a particular moment, right, where somebody makes an off-color comment, both of those groups might understand a version of what that feels like to be on the receiving end, to push back against, and then feel that weird, awkward retreating, right? So I think about, when I go through this, particular situations I've been in that have been curious, right? So, for example, as I've told you guys in previous videos, I came out as trans this summer. My other workspace does not know this. I work in construction as a day job, very masculine workplace, right? So these moments of, you have a bunch of very, very, what I would call Stone Mountain, but just very, very redneck, very aggressively macho men just letting words and statements fly about queer folk, gay people, so on and so forth. And there's a weird sort of balance of pushing back against it and also what happens when you push back against it, right? And whether or not you feel, despite being correct in calling it out, do you feel you have kind of like the appropriate backing of what's around you, as opposed to this weird kind of everyone else retracts and kind of takes it as you're causing trouble when you're just addressing trouble that has been caused, right? So section 3 is really interesting that way. Take the time to think about situations you or loved ones have been in, right? One that I bring up, for example, and she has a particular incident she puts in here, right? One of my best friends, he is Iranian Italian. His wife is half black, half Choctaw, Native American. And in an area that would like to purport itself to be very progressive, right? We're up in Portland, Oregon. We go to the grocery store, we're buying some booze, right? We're having a party with some of his friends after I get to meet them. We had gone to college together in the South. I get to meet his new friends up in the Northwest. He goes through the line, no problem, right? Kayvon is a lovely fellow, and like I said, he's half Iranian, half Italian, but he can present as white, right? His wife is a dark-skinned, black First Nations person, right? She goes through, and when Kayvon had gone through the line, not asked for the ID, and she's let through, no problem, right? Chambray goes through the line, immediately asked for her ID, which Kayvon, to his credit, as just an attentive partner, immediately called the cashier on, and it became one of these moments of like, oh, I didn't mean to, and just kind of like the transaction goes very quickly, like one of the examples here, right? Think of those moments where we're kind of exposed to a glimpse of unfairness to loved ones or to other people that were around, and think about that, right? And if you want to talk about any particular experience of them in your response, I'd be happy to read them. The next section we get to is 4. 4, I originally, on reading, will admit, was probably the hardest for me to place, but in revisiting it, it seems to be very much about both that theme of the suppression of the voice. Don't complain, and a lot of times here it's shown as kind of like groans or sighs, right? Don't have these micro or these small physical reactions to so much kind of systemic and hateful pressure being pressed down upon your very being, right? This pushback against, you shouldn't sigh. The world says stop doing that, right? The first one says don't sigh. The world says stop, right? Well, what is the danger of that, right? It's this internalized hurt that becomes very physical through this section, and to the point where there's a discussion of, after a certain point, you internalize it so much that you don't necessarily hear your own groans and sighs about the pain. And then that last note, one of the last notes is on 65 for me, right? Which kind of ends with, no one can get behind the feeling that caused a pause in the match. Not even the player trying to put her feelings behind her, dumping ball after ball into the net. You can retire with an injury, but you can't walk away because you feel bad, right? So this idea that this relationship between the injury to personhood versus and the injury physically, kind of a callback to that idea of like, specifically like Serena Williams' example with the ref kind of on the high chair looking down at you. It's interesting, and this idea that you're kind of encouraged and told to put it behind you, move forward, let it go, right? The very last one in that section on 66, feel good, feel better, move forward, let it go. Come on, come on, come on. In due time, the ball is going back and forth over the net. Now the sound can be turned back down. Your fingers cover your eyes, press them deep into their sockets. Too much commotion, too much for a head remembering to ache. Move on, let it go, come on, right? So this constant pressure of just let it go. It's going to stop hurting if you let it go without addressing the issues at hand. And I think Rankine's kind of highlighting that that's a flawed way of thinking. It only serves to internalize that hurt, okay? Part 5, very fascinating. I will not say particularly much about this section, right? What I'm going to suggest instead, right, is that since so much of the section deals with writing on its face, right, go back to that essay from Lord that poetry is not a luxury, and then look at this section, right? What is Lord telling us there about the necessity of access to the written word to express ourselves? and for the marginalized to give kind of voice to those parts of themselves, and then compare it to Part 5 of Citizen. And I think you'll see a lot of similarities. Very interesting section. Part 6. Part 6, I have, in my own notes before, annotated as essentially the tragedies, right? This section is a lot, right? Particularly if you remember living through these stretches. A lot of you guys would have been notably younger, right? I was, for example, Katrina, I was, 15, right? A great many of you might not remember what the incidence of that was like happening in the American cultural sphere at the time, right? And I wouldn't expect you to, given the age. It's interesting to poke through these and kind of relate them to it. I would suggest, and you don't necessarily have to do all of them, but if you don't remember what any of these particular moments were like, right, or they're a bit before your time, go back and just read the Wikipedia page about it even, right? Obviously there's bias in those things, but just to get a quick overview of what the thing is and then come back to this, right? And it is a deep rabbit hole of where all of the systemic racism bubbles up within each of those varied moments, right? And the way that section ends, right, with the long trailing fading list of in memoriams, right, in memory of Jordan Russell Davis, Eric Gardner, John Crawford, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, so many of these names rightfully stick in our minds nowadays that have become part of an unfortunately still necessary discussion, right? George Floyd happens and many of these names come up, so on and so forth, right? It's interesting to think about, right? And think about that entire section as being in memory of those moments and those, like, the dignity and people lost in them, right? And that last verse she gives us, right? Because white men can't police their imagination, black men are dying, right? If that's not, wildly indicative of what our discussion about policing is right now, I don't know what is, right? How many black men must die because the police assume this thing about them? They can't police their own imaginations about who a black man is and what he's doing, right, in a given instance, right? So much so that it is a lethal mistake, okay? Then we get to the last section, right? And we're back in the memoir here in a different sense, and this is probably the most verse, right, in the start. It gets incidental again when we get to particular moments. What I want you to take the time to do, right, is it's a very short section, right? I want you to read through it, right, and then go back to get to that last line, right? This interesting note for us to end the book on. There's a picture after that, but still, right, the interesting last word of the book, right? It wasn't a match, I say, it was a lesson, right? Repeat that. Think about that in context of the entire book, right? Each match that Serena Williams is playing, the match is discussed in the later chapters, right? Where we're talking about her watching it, right? Her playing tennis. Like each of these instances, is it a lesson? Who's the lesson for? What is the lesson, right? Unpack those and then kind of flip through that last chapter one more time and consider it in the broader context of everything we've talked about in the book. Okay, like I said, this book is a lot in an emotional sense. This book can be draining, right? So give yourself the time you need to go through it. Okay, I look forward to looking at your discussion posts, and we will have conversations about this book again later in the semester, much like we will with Lauren's work. Okay, stay safe, stay healthy. You have the kind of 2-week unit to unpack this, like the last book. Okay, so take care of yourselves, and if there's any questions, as usual, just reach out to me. Thank you guys so much.